Good evening, everybody, and you're most welcome to our October edition of the Masterclass series, which we provide in collaboration with ADHD Ireland, uh, ICANN, Hi Val, Maynooth University, UCD, which is ourselves here, myself and Beth, and of course, our colleagues in Maynooth University. So I'm really, really pleased that that we're joined today by Mr. John Marble, and I'm sure you'll actually be familiar with some of John's work previously, given that he is the co-author of Neurodiversity for Dummies and Autism for Dummies, which I think are very well known and well regarded books. But more generally, John is the founder of Pivot Neurodiversity. He is a writer and speaker on innovation, autism, and neurodiversity. In 2009, he was appointed by President Obama to the United States Office of Personnel Management, where his work focused on workforce development, innovation, and bringing Silicon Valley's best practices into government services. In addition to his White House service, he has served as an advisor and aide to Secretary Hillary Clinton, Senator John Kerry, and Vice President Al Gore. John lives in San Francisco, and John, you are autistic. And I mean, just to say, all my favorite politicians, but this is non-political, but lovely people to have been appointed by and to have engaged with. And as a visitor to San Fran, if I do recall having, I think it was a bowl of chowder, uh, and of course the lovely rail network you have there as well. So thank you so much for coming to speak to us and to all our viewers this evening. So as ever, please feel free to put comments and questions into the chat, but the questions, of course, into the Q&A function. And without further ado, over to yourself, John. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I should say, the next time you come to San Francisco, we do have a lovely rail network, at least for the United States. But the next time you come, definitely try one of our driverless taxis. That's my new favorite thing to show friends who visit. It's a bit unnerving at first getting into a vehicle without a driver, but it's a local party trick that I now do with friends. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Which hopefully works here, and then start the presentation. I was saying before we started that I, live here in San Francisco, speak a lot to tech companies. I don't think I've been to one tech company to do a presentation or a talk where their tech hasn't malfunctioned at some point. So the fact that I could get this up here, I'm really happy. Thank you so much for having me. I feel very honored, particularly because previous speakers include people that have been very important to my work, like Beth Radulski, Damian Milton, Autistic Doctors International. So I feel very honored. I am autistic. I should also say that I'm multiply neurodivergent, also ADHD, and dyscalculia as well. If you're not familiar with that, it's sort of like dyslexia, but with numbers. Dyslexia runs in my family, but for some reason, I'm the one in our family who has dyscalculia, which makes it very nerve-wracking every time I go out to dinner with friends and we have to figure out how to split the bill. But thank you so much. I should also say that I'm going to simplify some things here today. I know this audience is going to include a lot of people who are very well versed in neurodiversity, but increasingly a lot of my work, as was mentioned and as you see here, is really in explaining to the public in very plain language what neurodiversity is, which led my colleagues and I to write the Neurodiversity and Autism for Dummies books. And I think it's been a rewarding experience to realize that, oh, yeah, sometimes we get into our own echo chambers and use a lot of shorthand that we understand, a lot of us who are familiar with this. But I need to learn how to communicate. And I think we all need to learn how to communicate in ways that the public who aren't familiar with this can understand. So of course, most of you know that neurodiversity definitely has been a movement, but it's also just a natural fact of human variation. And the reason is not no two human brains think alike. Every brain processes things differently, and that is normal, not the exception. And the fact is, the diversity of minds have always existed throughout human history, as I'll note today. One last kind of housekeeping note that I'll notice, I'm now, as I do this, understanding why so many of my colleagues have two computer screens so that they can have notes up and two presentations. I'm relying on this screen to speak to you, and I have notes below and beside me. So if I'm looking about, that's what I'm doing. Um, so I want to just start by describing what is normalcy. And I'll pause here to say that I go to a lot of scientific conferences and a lot of different types of conferences. And usually, when somebody begins a presentation with a dictionary definition of the topic, Oxford's dictionary defines normalcy as, I tend to get up and go to another presentation because to me, that's just defining the presentation as maybe a little bit boring. Just a pet peeve when presentations start out that way. That being said, I'm going to start out this presentation in exactly that way because I think it is important. When we think of normalcy, when I say neurodiversity is normal, when I talk about normalcy, I mean that normalcy is just the state of things being usual, typical, or expected. I think that last part of it is expected is something that I'd like to dive in deeply today. It's important to remember too that normalcy isn't the same as ideal. It might be normal to expect a good amount of humans to be swimmers or to know how to swim. I don't think it's normal for us to expect that every human do that, or that every human swims at the same ability as somebody like Michael Phelps. I should also note that normal is something that's socially constructed, which I'll talk a little bit more as we go into this. I first want to just show you these photos because I think they're lovely. The one on the right is probably my best attempt at a selfie. I'm horrible about taking selfies. And the photo on the left is a photo I took where I was at. And this is a town of Luckerbad, Switzerland. I spent about 2 weeks there writing a book last summer. And if any of you are in the publishing industry or have had things published, whether academic or books, I say I was there writing a book. When it gets published, who knows when I'll actually finish it. But lovely town of Luckerbad, Switzerland. And I went there for a specific reason to write. And that's because Luckerbad was briefly the home of American writer James Baldwin. He went there to write his first novel, Stranger on the in the Mountain, but he also wrote an essay that's been deeply impactful to both myself personally and to my career in working in neurodiversity. And that essay was called Stranger in the Village. The house on the left here is the house that Baldwin lived in and wrote in. The portrait in the middle is by an artist who made this portrait of Baldwin on the shutter of his house. And each morning before I wrote, this is a book about James Baldwin I'm working on, I would go down 3 doors to this chalet just to be inspired and also to read this essay called Stranger in the Village. And the reason why this essay is so impactful to me is because at the heart of it, it's about normalcy and in understanding yourself as normal despite your differences. And as Baldwin was writing in this village, it was at a time that he was the first Black person that most of these villagers had ever seen. And he wrote about what that experience was like. And he certainly wrote about the negative things that he experienced by being different in that village. But he also wrote about how it bothered him when people would positively approach him because of his differences and assume a lot of different things about him, even if they were kind hearted. Because at the end of the day, he just wanted to be seen as normal, not as something different, but as something different, but also a part of the group. So that has informed me a lot as a neurodivergent person, as work in neurodiversity, is that there's this great line from the musical La Cage aux Folles that Dame Shirley Bassey covered in the song I Am What I Am, where it says, I am what I am. I don't want praise. I don't want pity. And to me, that is just a crucial lesson to learn about normalcy is yes, I can do things that are extraordinary. Praise that, but don't praise me just because I'm neurodivergent. Don't pity me just because I'm neurodivergent. Just accept me for who I am. And so there's a reason why normalcy matters, particularly as it comes to neurodivergent individuals. It's because how we define normal really determines who we include within our communities, within our networks, and how we design the systems that work for certain people. And how we define normal actually determines whose lives are made difficult and whose lives are made easier. So to understand that, let's take a look at why I say neurodiversity is normal. And I'll kind of give you just 3 reasons for that. And in writing these books, I kind of kept coming back to this again and again. The first is just the genetic story of neurodiversity. As I was writing our most recent book, Autism for Dummies, I had to have a conversation with our publisher and my editor about whether or not we really need to tell the genetic story of autism. And the case that I made was absolutely, because if we tell the genetic story of autism, what we can see is that it's just so inherently a part of the neurodivergent condition. And we see these equally with other neurodivergent conditions like ADHD and dyslexia. But just taking autism as an example, if we look at the genetic history of autism, and I could say it was a pretty big challenge to explain genetics in a way that was easy to understand in a For Dummies book. But the genetic story of autism shows us that the genes associated with different autistic traits have been with the human population certainly since humans first started migrating out of Africa. That's pretty as far back as we can trace genetic differences. And in all likelihood, they existed much earlier than that. So before we had writing, before we had societies, before we maybe even had spoken communication, we had genetic differences associated with autistic traits in the human population. And those genetic differences have continued to exist. The same thing we see with ADHD traits. And while there hasn't been a lot of research into genetics and dyslexia as opposed to other conditions, I can tell you that dyslexia has existed far longer than human writing systems have. And with that genetic history also comes human history. And while we can't go back and diagnose historical figures, there are certainly traits associated with many that we can look back on to see, yes, certainly this person has expressed different neurodivergent traits. Temple Grandin, who wrote the foreword to our book, along with Harish Srinivasan, who's a non-speaking autistic individual who's getting his PhD in neuroscience, Temple makes this point about, if you think back to the caveman days, who was it kind of making the inventions and making different tools? It probably wasn't the yakety yaks who were socializing around the fire. It's probably the people who were a bit withdrawn and standing back. We see this again and again of the benefits that different neurodivergent traits have in the human population and in human societies. And one of the points that I make in the book is that I think that there was a period of time where it was much easier for different neurodivergent brains to interact with society. But as we developed societies, it became harder and harder for us, which I'll talk about in a bit. However, the main point that I want to make about how neurodiversity is normal is simply the human connection. Every neurodivergent person is human. Every human is unique, and every human is deserving of dignity and respect. I don't think it's necessary for us to other anybody to say, well, your brain works differently than my brain, so your brain isn't as equal to my brain. Now, I've told about the genetic story, but I would also argue that this includes brains that maybe aren't inherent from the point of birth. Things like people with brain injuries or people whose brains change as they age. If we're really understanding neurodiversity as normal, we should understand that our lives as humans aren't static, and some people's physical conditions, mental conditions may change over time, and we should accommodate for that. Sorry, I'm just getting my notes. And I think that this is important because understanding yourself as normal, once you're able to do that, it really changes everything for you. And this is another lesson that I got from Baldwin. I teach neurodivergent students along with my colleagues. These are neurodivergent individuals, most of whom have college degrees, but are trying to figure out how to integrate into the workplace. And one point that I often make with them is that the point that you can understand yourself as a neurodivergent person as just as boring and as ordinary as everyone else, that's when you get your power. Certainly, you can become extraordinary, you can do extraordinary things, but having a different brain doesn't really set you out as anything extraordinary, just like having different colored hair or having any hair or having a different skin color does. You deserve to be treated as fully human and fully normal as everyone else. And these are kind of the buckets that I go over with my students about what this means. Once you understand yourself as normal, as a human being, and as neurodivergent, you start to have a deeper understanding of yourself and your needs. And when I talk to companies and do trainings on neurodiversity and talk to managers, I talk about different barriers that exist within the workplace. But one point that I make is that there's barriers from the workplace side. There's also internal barriers that neurodivergent people have to deal with. And most often, growing up, we are not taught who we are, how we think differently than other people, and how we experience the world differently than other people. And if we don't understand that, it's hard to advocate for our own needs in the workplace. So understanding is the predicate of self-awareness, and what's built on that is self-acceptance. I can tell you I love Whitney Houston, but I have one disagreement with her. She sings in The Greatest Love of All this line, which I love when I hear it sung: learning to love yourself is easy to achieve. I make the argument that it's the hardest lesson to do in life. And even as a neurodivergent person, I have to reteach myself acceptance again and again. But once you're self-aware of yourself, the neurodivergent person can then become a bit more assertive, not aggressive, but assertive in securing their own rights and accommodations. And I put it this way: if I understand myself as normal, and if there's barriers in front of me, why wouldn't I want those barriers to be removed? Or if I understand myself as normal and I need certain accommodations, why don't I deserve an accommodation so I can function in this society just like everyone else? And I truly believe that once you understand yourself as normal, as a neurodivergent person, it becomes much easier to process the society around you. What I teach my students is first understand and accept yourself, then go out and understand and accept maybe who neurotypical people are and build the translations between them. Unfortunately, the United States still lags behind much of Europe, where many neurodivergent children, particularly autistic children, at best are taught how to mirror neurotypical people. We're trying to move away from that, but much of our country is still stuck in that. I don't necessarily think it's bad to teach neurodivergent children how neurotypical people think and socialize, but they have to be taught first how to understand themselves before they can build translations with other people. I do the same thing when I talk to parents. Most of my work isn't focused on parents, but being a neurodivergent adult with friends with neurodivergent children. I'm sent a lot of friends of friends who have neurodivergent children who are trying to figure out their family and their child. So I do the same thing with them and helping them understand their child as normal. So when I talk to them, I talk to them about acceptance and accepting their child as normal. And I should qualify that by saying this doesn't mean dismissing the challenges that neurodivergent people face. The truth is, being neurodivergent in this world can be really, really tough. And if you're somebody particularly who has a lot of support needs, your life can be even harder. It doesn't mean that when you accept yourself that automatically everything is going to be easy, but you can't lessen the difficulty around you if you don't first accept who you and your child are. That goes into the second point that I make with parents about seeing neurodiversity as normal. That is, greater collaboration can come from that. And what I mean by that is that if you're a parent, you're wanting to do what's best with your child. But as you enter the school system, as you enter services, there's going to be a lot of challenges that you're going to have to face. But understanding yourself, your child as normal, suddenly clarifies a lot of the barriers that you'll have to go around and a lot of the conflicts that might arise in working with others. And it helps you shift your focus and, more importantly, shift the focus of other people on seeing your child as normal and removing the things that prevent them from full participation in society. I often say a lot of times that when it comes to autism, a lot of autistic people can have a monotone voice or get into a monotone voice. So if I'm doing that, I hope it doesn't seem like I'm yelling at you. I'm really happy today. This is something that, building on top of that, that's increasingly the focus of my work, is helping institutions and society see neurodivergent citizens as normal. And what I mean by that is working with workplaces, educators, service providers, and government to really see neurodivergent people as normal and not something to be patronized, but people who deserve to be served just like everyone else. So I go into a lot deeper dive on the subject when I talk to these populations. But I generally focus on how seeing neurodivergent citizens as normal can lead to better service, can lead to improved results, and can lead to stronger communities. And now that's a very top level thing, but it really is the hook that I use when I work with service providers in government. Of course, if we're wanting things to lead to better things, that must mean that where we are now isn't ideal, which is true. So I'd like to put a bit of empathy here on understanding how we got here. And I first started thinking about this when a parent was talking to me about the difficulties that her dyslexic child was having in school. And she says, we try and we try and we try. I just don't understand why teachers can't see how my child learns and why it is so difficult for my dyslexic child to succeed at school. So I paused and I thought about it. And I actually gave her a bit of an odd answer when I said, well, if we think about it, it's really the fault of Napoleon, or at least Napoleon's legacy. And what I mean by that is that after Napoleon had swept across Europe, when he was finally defeated, the kingdom of Prussia was so freaked out about the ability of somebody like Napoleon to invade that they decided that we have to do something to prepare our population for a future invasion, and at the same time to prepare our population to deal with the Industrial Revolution. So Prussia at the time totally radicalized how they approached education and built what is now known as the Prussian model of education, where some people in the United States took that model and adopted into our education model. And then UK, Ireland, and others, although Ireland has a bit more interjections, adopted that model as well. And it does a really good job of preparing people for the Industrial Revolution and largely the workplace. However, if you're a type of learner who falls outside of that model and you learn a bit differently, it can become very difficult for you to succeed. It's a bit heady, but I love tracing back history and then figuring out how to solve things where we are now based on where we came from. So I often argue that one of Napoleon's greatest legacies was making it more difficult by proxy for neurodivergent learners in today's environment. Of course, another great legacy that he gave us was ABBA with their song Waterloo. So I do have to credit him for that. And as I mentioned, the Prussian model of education, what I'm really talking about is that we currently live in a world that is built for the most. And what I mean by that is it's human nature that we traditionally design things for the most common. We see that in the Prussian model of education, where it was designed so that the most people could succeed. However, when we design things as humans, another human trait is that oftentimes we assume that others are just like us. For the longest time, we thought there was one type of brain, and we just built things that way. And I think it's important to recognize that we do this as humans, speaking universally, as a way to be efficient, not necessarily to be cruel. So oftentimes when barriers arise, including barriers for neurodivergent people, it's not as if the workplace or school systems or services set out to say, hey, let's design a system that really screws over neurodivergent brains. They went out to design a system that they thought worked for everybody, but it turns out it doesn't work for everybody. So there's adjustments that need to be made. Now, when I work with companies and educational institutions, I help them move from a world built for the most to a world built for the many. That includes things like universal design, where things work for them for as many people as possible, in order to remove those barriers, to have systems that adapt more quickly and really have things that work for everyone. An example of that is the frustration that friends of mine who use wheelchairs in New York City have, is that even in 2025, only 25% of New York subway stations are accessible to wheelchair users. The city is undergoing a multi-year process now and spending a lot of money now to make sure that 100% of subway stations are accessible. That's because when it was designed, it wasn't designed for everyone in mind. Now, as we do this, an increasing passion of mine in order to build a world that's more accessible for neurodivergent people and more inclusive of neurodivergent people is the necessity of using empathy. And what I mean by that is doing a work that sees people and not just problems. And here I'm not necessarily talking about the neurodivergent brain. I'm talking about people who might be opposed to diversity initiatives, maybe to talking about parents who really do see their child with dyslexia or ADHD as deficient and as people who need to be fixed. When we're writing our book, I kind of had a post-it note on my wall that reminded me to think about writing our books in a way that even somebody totally opposed to the concept of neurodiversity would still understand and find value in. And we make a whole point in our most recent book about autism about if we really are going to build a neuro-inclusive future, we have to find how we can build bridges with respect. I can tell you, going to a lot of autism research conferences, there's a particular figure who funds a lot of autism research that I think is hugely destructive to autistic people. I think that she has the wrong priorities. I'm totally opposed to her. I've spoken out against her. At the same time, I'm constantly searching for common connections. And recently, she published a prominent I won't say the publication because I don't want to say who it is, but a prominent op-ed regarding RFK Jr. and the claim that Tylenol causes autism. And she wrote an op-ed saying, this is totally untrue. What we need is better science, not false claims. And at that moment, I was so excited because this person who's kind of, I don't want to say my enemy, but somebody who's ideologically opposed to me, all of a sudden I found a commonality that we could work on. And I truly believe that the more that we understand each other, the better outcomes we have. I do this particularly, like I said, with parents who want to change their kids, particularly who want to change their autistic kids. I have to pause and say, instead of saying you're wrong, I have to pause and say, well, this person is saying this for a reason. And if I start peeling back those layers, it's probably rooted in the fact that they love their child and they want to do what's best for their child. And if I can identify those commonalities, then we can really find places that we can work. So I've been surprised at who I can work with in my career doing this. That's pretty much it. I should say I'm very nervous speaking to this group. It's a lot easier to speak to groups who aren't familiar with neurodiversity, but when you speak to your quote unquote family, you feel like you know this and you know me better than other people. It gives me a little bit of nervousness. I should also say you're watching me at the end of a long day, so thank you for those who might be tired but still joining. I'm talking to you in San Francisco, which is the beginning of the day, and I am not a morning person, so hopefully any fumblings that I have, I can chalk up to that. But that's just a very short synopsis of the kind of deeper things that I think about of neurodiversity as I approach different subjects. And hopefully you can tear me apart now with your questions and I can answer things a bit more poignantly. And Tim, is it okay if I stop sharing my screen at this moment?
Oh, sure. Yes, absolutely, John. So, I mean, just to say, that was probably the best presentation I've seen on the concept of normalcy or what it is to be normal. And I think as well the way you framed aspects of it around, the debate around. I saw it about 8 or 9, 10 years ago that, ADHD, for example, being perceived as a superpower. Now, for some people, uh, people may wish to describe their experience as a superpower, but for other people, they actually might find that offensive. So I think
Yeah.
it's really good to actually open these debates and explore them, and recognize, I guess, how I think you said that that to recognize that we're all human, we're all normal. Diversity is part of the human experience. So
Do you mind if
certainly
I?
not to be. Oh yeah, go
Yeah,
on. Yeah,
just quickly comment on that. That's something that my co-authors and I addressed in the book because particularly the autism book, a little bit of neurodiversity, we didn't want to present autism as a superpower. In that, the point that we make is that neurodivergent characteristics are neutral. And in certain contexts, it can be really, really difficult. And in other contexts, it could be a huge advantage. I'm somebody who's very sensitive to differences in frequency of sound. When I started out my career as a music journalist, that benefited me greatly because I could hear instruments in ways that my colleagues couldn't. You put me in a coffee shop or an open office environment, that superpower becomes a great challenge. And I'm reminded of, the autistic and Welsh actor, Sir Anthony Hopkins, has this great quote when he disclosed that he was diagnosed late in life with autism. And the reporter asked him if has autism helped him as an actor. And I'm paraphrasing now, but he basically says, yes, I like to look at things differently, to deconstruct a character, to figure out what makes them tick, and my view will not be the same as everyone else. And to me, that's my favorite quote about neurodiversity. Anthony Hopkins isn't saying that his autistic traits have given him 2 Academy Awards. And he's not saying that his autistic traits have made him a worse actor. He's saying, I'm different. I accept it. I bring that to my work. And in that context, that really does become the superpower.
hmm
I'll
and
try not with most of the answers not to go on and on like that.
no, 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 please do, John. And perhaps one final question from myself, and then others might come in. You spoke about other aspects of your work with companies and looking at how the workplace can be more amenable to the many. And I loved how you, I guess, expressed that uh, those couple of slides. But in helping companies to make their workplaces more amenable to the many, I'm just wondering what type of challenges and opportunities do you come across? Because sometimes there can be almost a clash of rights or a clash of needs
Oh, it's almost
across it. Yeah.
always a clash. It's almost always a clash. But I can tell you that no matter the particular conflict at work, and we get a lot of companies who say, I have this employee, I don't know what they are, but I want to keep them. What's going on? We just boil it down to say, look, you don't need to know everything about a person's neurodivergent condition to build workplaces that work for everybody. And there's always this point in deeper management trainings where we have a manager who has this aha moment and says, oh, I think what you're talking about doesn't just apply to neurodivergent people. Maybe that's why we can't keep women on our teams, or maybe that's why we can't attract people of color. It's because when you boil it down, there's a lot of similar patterns. And to give you an example, there's a stereotype out there of people with ADHD and autistic people maybe interjecting themselves into conversations that at times that other people find inappropriate. And a point that I make with managers is that yes, that certainly can happen, but so many of us are so fearful about speaking up in a meeting because we're fearful about being judged of whether somebody else thinks this is an appropriate time to speak or not. And by the way, in the United States, if you're the only immigrant in that meeting, if you're the only woman in that meeting, you have a lot of psychological pressures that make you question that as well. So I'll just end it with saying that I once spoke at a company about neurodiversity here in Silicon Valley. And at the end, an executive came up to me and she said, I have no connection to neurodiversity at all. I was just interested in what you had to say. However, could you come back and say everything that you just said, but just mention parents? Because I had our parent employee resource group. And in Silicon Valley, people just don't understand that people are working parents and have different needs than the, single guy Stanford grads that the industry is built around. So I'm constantly looking for those underlying patterns that we might be the hard case at work as neurodivergent people, but everybody benefits from better communication, more accessibility, more clear instruction. So if you can figure it out with our brains, it tends to help everybody.
Okay. Thanks so much, John, and perhaps Val and Ken. And I think we have some queries coming in from people watching.
Cool. Well, good afternoon, John. How are you? Hope things are good in California this morning. And they're not too bad here in Dublin this afternoon, which is unusual for late autumn. There's a question in there just coming in, so, and saying, I work in OH and we have the same discussions with employees all the time, that they do not need to know the specific medical details to be able to support employees in the workplace. And just in terms of myself working with ADHD, we do talk to an awful lot of corporate organisations as well. But what we find is, and I think this question goes to the heart of what this questioner was asking, and it's around disclosure. And people disclosing and not disclosing, companies needing to know or not to know.
Yeah, I'm always not wary, but try to approach this delicately because laws vary from country to country, whether it's Ireland, the EU, the United States. And honestly, I should have better prepared for this question because it's something that comes up a lot again and again. I can tell you in the United States, there's particular laws, and if you, as a person, if you disclose before there's a quote unquote problem at work, that gives you more protections than other people. But flipping it back again, one of the most routine things that we get, as I mentioned, our manager saying, do I ask this employee? How do I figure out their needs without asking directly? And again, it goes back to seeing the person as an individual, asking how they communicate best, how they work best, and really going from there. And by the way, I do this the same with our neurodivergent students, is teaching them, just as you want empathy as a neurodivergent worker, have empathy for your manager and your colleagues. Because in the United States, we don't teach people how to manage anymore. They tend to be promoted and then all of a sudden have to manage people. Your manager has their own pressures that they have to deal with. And if you can proactively go to them and say, hey, I work best if you provide me written instructions as opposed to kind of what I call drive-by verbal instructions. Or if I can make this adjustment, this is how I can be more productive. I think really getting to know each other as individuals helps a lot. And that's my long-winded way of saying I want to be careful because every country is unique with the legal systems.
You don't need to be careful here. It's okay. We've been doing this a long time. Grant. And just come in as a second part question from the same person. And I think just it's more around the modern world and where we are today. And social media has set back disclosure a lot. And saying I have a lot of employees not wanting to disclose for fear of ridicule due to how ND is represented and TikTok and other places.
Well, I can tell you that there's always a fear of disclosure. And I'm autistic, ADHD, have dyscalculia. And even with my closest friends, I catch myself sometimes of like, oh, do I disclose now? Or if I'm meeting somebody or if I'm going on a date with somebody, it's something that I have to routinely remind myself that it's okay to disclose. It doesn't mean that everything is going to go well for you. I disclosed at one job and asked for a very small accommodation. I think it was to have my back against the wall and not to the open office environment. My manager said, no problem. I walked into work the next day and all of my work had been reassigned to my 21-year-old intern, and I had no work to do. And I had to get HR involved. Turns out my manager had a lot of problems with a lot of other employees. But at the same time, I still remember the time that I was meeting with the deputy director of White House personnel in the White House mess. And at the end of lunch, I said, Dave, I have to tell you something that only my best friend and my parents and my doctor knows. But I have autism. I need to ask my manager for accommodation. I don't know how to do that. And it got silent for what I thought was 20 minutes. It was 1/100th of a second, but I was so anxious about it. But his response changed my life. He said, John, that's fantastic. And I looked at him confusingly, and he said, well, you seem confused. And I said, I am confused. Why would you say that? He said, I've known you a long time. Have you ever thought your autism has been a benefit at work? And I said, no, I've overcome it. I've papered over it. I've become really good at hiding it. He was like, no, 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 no. He said, in White House personnel, my job is to bring together people to solve big problems. And he said, you work in innovation. What's your number one rule of innovation? And I said, well, to get a diversity of outcomes and possibilities, you have to have a diversity of input. And I was thinking data. But he said, it works the same way with humans. He's like, I can't hire everybody from the East Coast or the West Coast, and I can't hire everybody from one demographic background, and I can't hire everybody with the same brain if we're going to really collaborate and solve big problems. So he said, I will help you get your accommodation. To this day, we can't remember what I asked for, but I need you to accept yourself and bring that to work. And once I did, it was a long process. I started, being pulled into meetings that weren't in my portfolio. How do we stop Ebola from jumping to the United States? How do we make airport security lines smaller and shorter without sacrificing security? And it wasn't because I had a better brain. It was because I just had a different brain and had a different perspective. And again, I'm getting long-winded, like a lot of people do. But that's just, a disclosure is scary. Sometimes it leads to greater outcomes. Sometimes, you do have difficulty, but over time, I really do believe we're better off disclosing.
Well, that's what I said. It is the biggest challenge we see here in Ireland in terms of implementing EDI or DEI. And just a question, I'm not sure you might know the answer to this, but I was intrigued when you said it earlier. Forgive me, I did love all the musical references. We probably have different musical tastes, but I did love all the musical references. You mentioned that dyslexia is known before there was human writing history. How did they know the people with dyslexia before there was writing?
Oof, it's been a while since I wrote about this. So,
Okay.
but I can tell you, like, we tend to think of dyslexia as being tied to reading, which definitely is, but it's more of a processing, also communication difference. And the genetics associated with that go back a long ways. I'm going to get the percentage wrong, but basically, we didn't have writing systems for 99.9% of human history. And as writing systems became evolved, again, it's another example of things built for the most. We just kind of assumed that other people got this. It turns out some writing systems are more dyslexic friendly than others. And I should say, even though writing didn't exist for 99.9% of human history, even when we had writing, I don't think it was until the 20th century where the majority of humans actually read. So we had people out there with dyslexic traits and how they visually process the world. Why was that? I would love to see more research into that. What role did it play in human history? Why are these genetic differences passed down even before we had reading?
And just nothing that you mentioned at the very start of your talk. You mentioned all the beyond world-leading thought makers in terms of neurodiversity that have already been on the Master series. Another one of them was Damien Milton. You briefly discussed the double empathy problem.
Yeah. You want me to discuss it? Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, hugely influential, I think, both to autistic individuals where it first came about, but increasingly the last International Society of Autism Research Conference I went to, I could see the huge impact on other people's work. And I'm probably going to get this wrong and trying to explain it in plain language, but for the longest time, we assumed that when it came to uh, how we empathize with others, that the deficit was on the autistic individual's part. And you can extrapolate that to ADHD, dyspraxia, whatever. But what Milton really showed, I mean, he's very much still alive, but what Milton really showed was that there's an equal misunderstanding of empathy on the neurotypical person's part. And we're just not understanding ourselves. That was hugely impactful on me as a person and also to my work. I should say, building on that, Dr. Sue Fletcher Watson with the University of Edinburgh, who would be a fantastic person for your series if
Oh, we've
you
had her
haven't
already.
had her on. Oh, okay. But she built on that work, and again, I'm oversimplifying her work, where her and her colleagues were able to take autistic people, put them together in a room, have them communicate about a task, and went beautifully. Then they took neurotypical people, put them in a room, had them communicate about a task, and went beautifully. When you put them together, things started falling apart. Because we have differences in the way we communicate, natural differences in the way we socialize, natural differences in body language. And so I really do believe that the future of neurodiversity is helping neurodivergent people understand and accept who they are, helping neurotypical people understand and accept us too, and also us understanding and accepting neurotypical people. Because once we can understand our differences, we can build those translations and empathy.
Very much so.
That's a really good point, John, and it actually speaks to a point that Gregory put in the chat there, which is a paraphrase of Orwell. All people are created differently, but some are more different than others. It's called neurodiversity. So, and I was reading that, and obviously it sounds like the Animal Farm quote, but it really resonated when you were talking about your colleague in the White House who said to you, you disclosed to him and he went great, and you were so surprised by his reaction, because there's whether or not you agree, some people are more different than others, but there's a neurodiversity thing there, and it should just be accepted, like you're saying. However, Frankie comes in and says, when discussing autism and other neurodiversities, I sometimes hear, well, we're all a bit autistic. My response is, would you say that a person wearing glasses is blind? If not, then don't dilute the meaning by applying it to everyone, which I find really interesting, because maybe as a neurotypical person, I might have gone, oh, sure, I think that way sometimes too, or something. But, it is diluting it, which isn't fair. So what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel the same way. But again, I want to be empathetic to people about why they say that. So I tend to pivot from that to then explain what the autism spectrum really means, where people usually think of it as linear from a little autistic to a lot of autistic. So when people say, oh, everyone's a little autistic, it's more of like a round kaleidoscope where you have this, or looking up in the sky, seeing 1,000 different stars. Any person can have one of these traits and not be considered autistic. It's just autistic people tend to have a lot of these traits. So it's a particular constellation of them. So yes, you could be sensitive to noise and not be autistic. You could have more, concrete thinking and not be autistic. And so I tend to explain it that way. I also have to be careful sometimes because we're seeing more and more that autism is, I never can say this word, hereditable, passed down through genes. And so when I speak a lot, you see more and more parents who, and also ADHD, who go through their own diagnostic journey after having a child diagnosed. So I have to be careful, because if a parent says that to me, I don't want to say, well, you might want to, you might be undiagnosed yourself. But again, No, we're not all a little autistic, but we should be empathetic as to why somebody might say that and address that. But yes.
Yeah, good point. Also, you mentioned Temple Grandin earlier on, and Gregory says she must be the most famous autistic person. Why has acknowledging women being autistic been slow to be accepted?
Oh, that you if you haven't, have an entire masterclass about that because it's something that particularly hits us in the United States when we look at our own statistics. As many people know, our diagnostic tests around autism were very rigid for a long time, and initially were set around young, typically white, middle income to upper class boys, and the kind of a lot of the cultural characteristics that went along with that. And one of the points that I make, at least in the United States, with our rise in incidence rates, is every time it's jumped from 1 in 100 people to 1 in 50 to, I believe it's 1 in 36 or 32. I usually have this off the top of my head. Every revision has been tied to capturing more women and girls or people of color, people who were previously left out of the diagnostic process. So when you ask what's the problem with our understanding of women and girls, you please have an entire masterclass on that because I will attend that because I think it's one of the most crucial things in the autism space. I would also argue in the ADHD space as well, is understanding.
We did have a really good speaker at the end of last year, and her name escapes me, but she was talking about particularly neurodiverse diagnoses in women and the hormone thing as well. Obviously, all humans have hormones, but obviously as women, we're susceptible maybe to hormonal changes at a certain age, and also because diagnoses are coming later in life, and if you're perimenopausal and you're undergoing a diagnosis procedure, that's a minefield perhaps.
Yeah.
So yes, absolutely, you could have several
So many,
sessions.
cultural layers involved in that too. In the United States, we'll tend to look at, difficulty making small talk. I was like, I remember when I went to Finland, I thought like, was everybody autistic? But why do I feel so free? It's because it's a culture where nobody makes small talk. And I'm like, oh, as an autistic person, do you want to talk to me? Have I not met you and you just want to tell me your troubles? Yes, I'm ready for that. You want to talk to me about the weather? I am incredibly confused when I have an app on my phone while you're talking about the weather. So we design these things, we design diagnostic criteria as, again, out of reflection of assuming everybody's like us, whether cultural or not. So yeah, it's just we're in the DSM-5. I'm just waiting for the fights that happen for the DSM-6 around this. Or the productive engagement, I should say. I shouldn't just assume it'll be fights. But.
Oh yeah.
We just have a couple of minutes left. So if anybody has any other question for John or comment.
Just one question. We're allowed one curveball. Timmy allows me one curveball. Just in terms of looking at the DEI agenda, and let's say the DEI agenda worldwide, how do you see the DEI agenda going worldwide since the beginning of 1925? Or sorry, 2025.
Are you talking about problems with DEI?
No problems with DEI, but how it's been implemented in certain countries, specifically America.
Well, I can speak from the United States because this is something that I think deeply on, and I have a different perspective about DEI. Is that prior to working in the neurodiversity space, when I was working in the Obama administration, much of my work was on innovation and what makes companies innovative and successful. And again, I had mentioned that if you want more outcomes, whether you're designing a product, a system, or a service for people, you need a diversity of input, whether that's data points or different life experiences. So the more that you can diversify your workforce as reflective of your society, the better off that you're going to be. However, that is not the conversation right now around DEI in the United States. And a lot of people are panicked. People are scrubbing websites. They're wondering whether or not they should have trainings on neurodiversity. So it's a big, big challenge. But again, this is another place where I apply empathy and think, okay, if I'm explaining this, how do I explain this in a way that even somebody who is rabidly opposed to any DEI initiative might understand? And oftentimes that can be a hard challenge, but at the end of the day, I really believe that it can be successful. And hopefully we can get to a point where we're having more rational discussions again and not just reactionary discussions. Because I really do think that the current negative focus really is dragging down the workplace from a lot of different angles.
Very much your candor on that. At this stage, I get the hand back to Timmy.
Okay, so John, there isn't too much more we can say. I really think that it's been an interesting hour or so here. I really enjoyed the conversational approach as well. And a thank you to the people watching and indeed anybody watching on playback. Uh, the comments that we had in the chat and the questions were really, really insightful. Um, but I would really urge anybody who has the opportunity to take a look at your socials, but also a pivot diversity, which really I think showcases the breadth of your work, and certainly again neurodiversity for dummies and autism for dummies. I mean, so many of us have availed of that series. It's really excellent. So I'm delighted. I've only read the neurodiversity for dummies book. I haven't actually got my copy of the autism book yet, but no doubt I will. So we can only say thank you so much for joining us from San Francisco early in your day. Before we say goodbye, next time out, we're joined by Sarah Gardner from Bellevue College in the States. And Sarah is the founder and lead of Neurodiversity Navigators. So I think for anybody working in higher education or even more generally, I'm sure that will be a worthwhile talk. So we'll see you in November. And again, a big thank you to Ken and Val from ADHD Ireland. A big thank you to John and to everybody for watching. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.